The first thing I noticed was the smell. Even before I stepped inside, before I laid eyes on the apartment, I could smell it. The thick, cloying stench of something rotting beneath layers of artificial air freshener. It clung to the walls, to the old carpeting, to my clothes. I had been dreading this moment. My cousin, Daniel, had lived here. Until a week ago, when he was found dead. They told me it was an accident, that he had passed out in his own bed, that something about a gas leak had suffocated him in his sleep, that it was peaceful. I didn't believe them, because I had spoken to Daniel 2 days before he died, and he hadn't sounded peaceful. He had been terrified. Now, standing in the middle of his cramped, dimly lit apartment, I could still hear his voice in my head. "It's watching me," he had whispered over the phone. "I don't know how it got in, but it's here. It doesn't leave. It just watches." I had tried to ask him who it was. He wouldn't answer, just kept repeating that he hadn't slept in 3 days, that every time he closed his eyes, he felt something breathing next to him. Then the call had cut out, and 2 days later, he was dead. I swallowed hard, glancing around. The apartment wasn't much, just a single-bedroom unit, the kind with cheap furniture and flickering fluorescent lights. But everything was wrong. The furniture had been rearranged. The couch pushed awkwardly against the far wall, the coffee table overturned, the chairs stacked in a haphazard pile. The walls, they were covered in scratches. Not just in one place, everywhere. Deep, jagged grooves ran along the length of the walls, as if something had dragged its nails through the plaster. My stomach twisted. Daniel had done this. I could picture him in my mind, pacing in the dark, dragging his fingers along the walls, leaving desperate marks behind. Or maybe he hadn't done it. A shiver ran through me. I moved toward the bedroom, stepping carefully over the mess of papers scattered across the floor. There were so many papers. Torn pages, sticky notes, notebooks filled with frantic, messy handwriting. I knelt down, picking up a crumpled piece. The ink had smudged, but I could still make out the words. "It sees me." I grabbed another page. "It stands in the doorway at night. It doesn't move. It doesn't blink." And another. I locked the door, but I think it's already inside. I let the paper slip from my fingers. The air inside the apartment felt thick now, pressing down on me like an unseen weight. I could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant muffled sound of a TV in a neighboring unit. And then, a creak. A slow, deliberate creak from the bedroom door. I turned sharply, my pulse hammering. The door was slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it swallowing the weak light from the hallway. I stepped forward. The bedroom smelled worse than the rest of the apartment. A sickly sweet stench, like spoiled meat left out in the heat too long. Daniel's bed was still unmade. His blankets tangled, the pillow knocked to the floor. But it was the closet that made my breath hitch in my throat. The door was wide open, and inside, something was hanging. Not clothes. A blanket. A thick, heavy blanket, strung up like a curtain, completely blocking the back of the closet. I took a slow step forward. Daniel had covered something. Something he didn't want to see. I reached out, fingers trembling, and pulled the blanket aside. And that's when I saw it. The hole. A jagged, irregular hole had been cut into the wall. No, not cut. It had been torn, as if someone had dug through the drywall with their bare hands. It led into the neighboring unit. My breath hitched. I leaned forward, shining my phone's flashlight into the hole. The space beyond was pitch black. And then, something moved. A shape, just beyond the reach of my light. A figure. Tall. Too tall. Crouched, its limbs bent at unnatural angles. I barely had time to see it before it saw me. The flashlight flickered. The air shifted. A whisper. Low. Rasping. I staggered back, my shoulders slamming into the edge of the doorframe. The phone slipped from my grasp, landing face down on the floor, the screen casting a dim glow against the ceiling. And then, the blanket moved. Something on my side of the wall had pushed it. I bolted. Out of the bedroom, through the living room, my heartbeat a frantic drumbeat in my ears. The apartment door was closed. I didn't remember closing it, but I didn't stop. I yanked it open, stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. The corridor was empty. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their dull glow making the walls seem yellowed and sickly. I turned back toward Daniel's apartment. The door stood open, revealing nothing but dark shadows within. It was still inside, watching, waiting. I should have run. I should have, but my phone was still inside. And something told me that if I left it there, if I abandoned it inside that apartment, I'd never really leave at all. I took a deep breath, and I stepped back inside. The moment I stepped back inside, I felt it. The shift in the air. Like stepping into a place that didn't belong to me anymore. The door closed softly behind me, not slamming, not jerking, just shutting with a quiet finality that sent a cold pulse of dread through my chest. I swallowed hard, forcing myself forward. My phone was still on the floor, its dim glow barely illuminating the warped wooden boards. I crouched, reaching for it. And the closet door creaked. Not fully, just a fraction. Enough to let something slip through. I froze, my fingers hovering over the phone. My breath hitched, my pulse hammering against my ribs. Then, a whisper. Close. Too close. Don't leave. I yanked the phone off the floor, stumbling back, flashlight flickering as I swung it wildly toward the closet. The blanket covering the hole was still swaying. Something had moved it. Something was behind it. I backed toward the door, my fingers tightening around my phone, my breath coming fast and shallow. The apartment was wrong. It felt bigger now. The walls seemed further apart, stretching unnaturally, like I had stepped into a version of this place that wasn't real anymore. The air felt dense, thick, heavy with something unseen. And then, a shadow moved. I saw it. Not in the closet. Not in the hole. It was standing in the corner of the room, just beyond the glow of my flashlight. Tall, bent, watching. It didn't breathe. It didn't move. But it was there. I felt its presence pressing into my skull, into my bones, into every fragile, trembling part of me. Then it took a step forward, and I saw its face. Or what should have been a face. There was no skin, no mouth, no eyes, just teeth. An empty, gaping maw, lined with rows of teeth that never ended. I didn't think. I ran. My legs nearly gave out beneath me as I lunged for the door, fingers scrambling for the handle. The apartment groaned as I moved, like the very walls were trying to hold me inside. Behind me. It followed. The floor creaked beneath its weight, the sound wrong, like bones bending the way they shouldn't. I yanked the door open now. But the hallway was different. It was longer. Stretching. The buzzing lights overhead flickered, warping the world into a sickening, hazy blur. The doors to the other units had vanished, swallowed by the endless stretch of pale, peeling wallpaper. I wasn't in the apartment building anymore. I had stepped somewhere else. Somewhere it wanted me to be. A cold realization crawled up my spine. Daniel had tried to leave. Daniel had run. But he never made it out. Neither would I. Not unless I stopped running. I turned. The thing was closer now. Still standing in the doorway, its body folding into itself, its mouth twitching in an impossible grin. It was waiting. It wanted me to run. It wanted to chase. I forced myself to breathe, to think. If I ran, I'd never stop running. Just like Daniel. I took a step forward. Toward it. The grin twitched. The air shivered. I kept moving. Slow. Steady. It didn't move, but I could feel its teeth, its hunger coiling around me like invisible tendrils. You can't leave. The words weren't spoken. They were inside my head. A writhing, slithering thing crawling through my thoughts. I clenched my jaw. One more step. Then another. The thing lurched. The lights went out. Total darkness swallowed everything. For one terrible, breathless second. I felt its mouth against my cheek. I screamed. And then, I was in the stairwell. The real stairwell. The hallway was normal again. The apartment door was gone. Not closed. Not locked. Gone. Like it had never existed. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged, gasping pulse. My hands trembled as I clutched my phone to my chest, the screen flashing 3 a.m. in stark white digits. I turned. The building was silent. Empty. The only sign that anything had happened was the faint, lingering echo of my own breath in the cold, stale air. I made my way down the stairs, each step slow and careful, waiting for the world to shift again. But it didn't. When I stepped outside, the night air hit me like a slap. Crisp. Real. The sky was still dark, the city quiet. I was out. I turned back toward the building, expecting to see the apartment window. But there was nothing there. No window. No room. As if it had been erased entirely. As if it had never been there at all. My stomach twisted. Daniel had been right. Something had been in there with him. Something that didn't just watch. Something that waited. And I had almost taken his place. I walked away, my pulse still hammering. The city stretched before me, its neon lights flickering in the distance. But as I moved, felt it. That lingering, hollow gaze. like something had followed me out, like something was still watching. And in the reflection of the glass storefront beside me, I saw a shadow that wasn't mine. The house was supposed to be empty. That was what I told myself as I stood in the middle of the dimly lit living room, staring at the worn-out couch covered in dust. The smell of stale air and old wood clung to the walls, mingling with something sour underneath, a scent that made my stomach turn. I had inherited this place after my brother, Gary, disappeared. They never found a body, just his abandoned car a few miles from here, doors wide open, engine still running. It had been almost 2 years. And now, the house was mine. It didn't feel like mine. I walked toward the hallway, my boots echoing against the hardwood floor. Every step sent a puff of dust into the air. The whole place had been left untouched since the police finished their investigation. They had found nothing, no forced entry, no signs of struggle, no answers. As I reached the first door, something cold brushed against my arm. I froze. It was subtle, like a breath against my skin, but enough to make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I turned sharply. The room behind me was empty, just shadows stretching across the walls, fed by the dim light coming through the broken blinds. I swallowed hard, shaking my head. I was letting the atmosphere get to me. That's all. The hallway led to the bedrooms, 2 on the left, 1 on the right. I hesitated before reaching for the doorknob of the first one. My brother's room. I hadn't been in here since we were kids. The door creaked open, revealing a space frozen in time. The bed was unmade, the blankets twisted like he'd gotten up in a hurry. A dresser stood against the far wall, its drawers half open, as if someone had been searching through them. That was wrong. The police had told me they left everything the way they found it. But these drawers had been closed in the crime scene photos. I was sure of it. I stepped inside, my heart pounding. Dust coated everything, except for the surface of the dresser. Someone had touched it recently. Someone had been here. The floorboard behind me creaked. I spun around, flashlight shaking in my grip, but there was nothing. Nothing but the empty doorway leading back to the hall. I exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of my neck. Get a grip, I muttered under my breath. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I moved to the dresser, my fingers tracing the edges of the open drawers. Something shifted inside, just a faint rustling, like paper brushing against fabric. I reached in and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. Gary's handwriting covered the first page. I keep hearing it at night. The knocking. 3 times, always the same. I swallowed hard and turned the page. It knows my name. My stomach dropped. The next page was scribbled over, the ink so dark it had torn through the paper. I shouldn't have let it in. A shiver ran down my spine. I flipped to the last written entry, dated just 2 days before Gary disappeared. If anyone finds this, don't open the door. A sound cut through the silence. A slow, deliberate knock. Not from outside. From the closet. My entire body went cold. The knock came again, steady and unhurried. I took a shaky step back. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe a branch against the window. Maybe a loose pipe shifting in the walls. But I knew better. The knocks were coming from inside the closet. I should have left. I should have turned around, walked out of the house, and never come back. But instead, I reached for the handle. My fingers trembled as I gripped the cold metal, my breath shallow and uneven. The door swung open with a low groan. Nothing. The closet was empty. Just dust-covered shelves, a few old shirts hanging limply on their hangers. But as I stepped closer, I saw something scratched into the back wall. Deep, jagged letters carved into the wood. Help me. The breath caught in my throat. I reached out, my fingertips tracing the grooves, feeling the desperation behind each letter. Then, just behind me, a whisper. Not words. Just the shape of breath against my ear. I turned so fast that I nearly tripped over myself, flashlight beam swinging wildly across the room. The air felt electric, charged with something unseen, something watching. The closet door slammed shut on its own. I bolted out of the room, my pulse hammering. I didn't stop moving until I was in the living room, gasping for breath. My hand shook as I braced myself against the old wooden coffee table. I wasn't alone here. Something had happened to Gary in this house, something worse than anyone had realized. And now, it was happening to me. From somewhere deep within the house, I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. Only this time, it wasn't just from one place. It was coming from every door, every wall, surrounding me. The knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, spreading through the walls, moving from room to room. It wasn't random. It had a rhythm, deliberate and patient, like something waiting for me to respond. Knock, Knock. Knock. My breath came in ragged gasps as I turned in a slow circle, flashlight trembling in my grip. The walls seemed to pulse with each hit, the sound reverberating through the air, through my bones. I needed to get out. Now. I stumbled toward the front door, nearly tripping over the old rug. My fingers fumbled with the deadbolt, twisting it, pulling at the knob. Locked. I hadn't locked it. I swore I hadn't. I yanked at it harder, but it refused to budge, like it had fused to the frame. My stomach clenched. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. The knocking changed. It wasn't on the walls anymore. It was right behind me. Knock. 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 Slow. Close. Almost playful. I turned, hard hammering, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the glow. The house was still. Nothing moved. But I felt it. The presence. Something watching. Something waiting. Then, just beyond the flickering shadows, I saw it. The hallway. The locked door at the end of it. The chains were gone. The padlocks lay scattered across the floor, twisted and broken, as if something had torn them apart from the inside. My chest tightened. I had two choices. Stay here and wait for whatever was coming, or go inside. Neither felt like the right answer, but I couldn't just stand here. If I was trapped, I needed to know what I was dealing with. I forced my feet forward, each step slow and heavy. The closer I got, the colder the air became, like I was stepping into another place entirely. My breath misted in front of me. The door was open just a crack, enough to see the darkness beyond. I hesitated. Then, from deep inside the room, a voice. Hoarse. Scraping. Not human. Let me out. I recoiled, my entire body screaming at me to run. But my feet were planted. My fingers tightened around the flashlight. The voice came again. Please. Not a demand. Not a threat. A whisper. A plea. A trick. I reached for the door, pressing against the wood. It swung open with a slow, agonizing creak. The flashlight beam cut through the blackness, revealing nothing. The room was empty. At least, that's what I told myself at first. Then I saw the walls. They weren't walls at all. They were covered in scratches. Thousands upon thousands of deep, jagged marks, like fingernails clawing at the wood. The floor was the same. The ceiling. The corners. A prison. I swallowed against the bile rising in my throat. Gary had been in here. And he hadn't been alone. My flashlight flickered. The air shifted. Then the smell hit me, rotten, damp, wrong, like something had been left to decay for far too long. And that's when I saw it. In the farthest corner of the room, just at the edge of the light, something was crouched. A shape. Thin. Hollow. Arms too long. Joints bent in the wrong places. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. But I knew it was looking at me. I couldn't see its eyes, but I felt them. A slow, crawling awareness, burrowing into my skull. I stepped back. It stepped forward. Not walking. Not moving in any way I understood. Just closer. My throat closed up. It was still in shadow. Still not fully seen. But something about that absence was worse. Like if I saw its full shape, if I truly understood what I was looking at, it would understand me too. A deep pressure built in my ears. The whisper came again. Let me out. No. No. I turned and ran. Out of the room, into the hallway, heart slamming against my ribs. The walls groaned as I passed them, though it's stretching, shifting, like the house itself was waking up. I reached the front door. This time, it opened. The night air hit me like a shock. Cold and sharp. Real. I ran to my car, hands shaking as I wrenched the door open and threw myself inside. The keys. I had left them on the table. No. 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 I looked back at the house, my chest heaving. The door was still open, the darkness inside pressing against the frame, as if something was waiting. I had to go back. I had to. The backseat creaked. I went still. The air inside the car changed. Heavy. Thick. I wasn't alone. I turned my head. In the rearview mirror, a shape. Long fingers stretching toward me. A mouth, too wide, splitting open out. Let me out. I screamed. And then, everything went black. The engine sputtered once, then twice, before giving up entirely, leaving me stranded on the narrow, tree-lined road that led to my uncle's property. I muttered a curse under my breath and glanced at the dashboard, the needle of the fuel gauge stubbornly pointing toward empty. That wasn't possible. I had filled up just a couple of hours ago. But when I turned the key, the engine only coughed in protest like a dying animal. Great. Outside, the wind had picked up, sending a scattering of brittle autumn leaves skittering across the cracked pavement. The house stood at the end of the driveway, its hulking shape barely visible through the thickening fog that had begun to settle in, as if the land itself was trying to hide it from view. It had been over 20 years since I last set foot here. Back then, I was a boy, barely 10, spending summers in this house under the watchful but distant gaze of Uncle Henry. The memories of those childhood visits came back in pieces, flashes of wandering the overgrown backyard, the way the ancient floorboards creaked no matter how carefully I stepped, the suffocating silence that filled the house after dark. But there was one memory that stood out among the rest. The door. Even now, just the thought of it sent a prickle of unease down my spine. I shook it off. It was just a door. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat and stepped out onto the gravel driveway, my boots crunching against the damp stones. The air smelled of wet earth and something else, something faintly metallic beneath the layers of decay. The towering trees lining the property swayed in the wind, their bare branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. I didn't want to be here. But Uncle Henry had left me this house, and I had no choice but to deal with it. I made my way up the steps, the wooden porch groaning under my weight. The key, old and rusted, fit into the lock with difficulty, and when I finally managed to turn it, the door swung open with a sound like a dying breath. The house greeted me with a wall of musty air, thick with dust and neglect. The first thing I noticed was how little had changed. The furniture remained exactly as it had been when I was a child, the dark leather armchair by the fireplace, the heavy oak dining table covered in a thin layer of dust, the old grandfather clock standing like a silent sentinel in the corner. It felt as if time had stopped the moment Uncle Henry had died. And then there was the door. At the end of the long hallway, partially obscured by shadows, it stood just as I remembered. Only now, it was chained shut. Thick, rusted iron chains wrapped around the wood like a vice, secured by heavy padlocks. My mouth went dry. That room had always been open before. I stepped closer, hesitant, my pulse thrumming in my ears. Why would Uncle Henry lock a room in his own house? The house had other rooms for storage, an entire basement he barely used. There was no reason to barricade a simple door like this. I reached out and ran my fingers over the cold iron links, feeling the roughness of corrosion beneath my fingertips. And then, thud. The sound was deep, resonant, coming from the other side of the door. I yanked my hand away. Silence. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe. It was nothing, just the house settling. Old places like this made sounds, especially when they'd been empty for weeks. I took a step back, shaking off the unease curling in my gut. But before I could turn away, the sound came again. Thud. Louder this time. The air in the hallway seemed to shift, growing heavier, pressing down on my chest. My mind scrambled for an explanation. It had to be an animal. Maybe a raccoon had gotten in through a broken window. That was logical. That was rational. But then something else happened. A whisper. Soft, raspy, curling through the dim hallway like smoke. My name. My blood turned ice. I stepped back so fast that I nearly tripped over my own feet. The sound, no, the voice, had come from behind the locked door. That was impossible, wasn't it? My breath hitched in my throat as I forced myself to listen. For a long moment, there was only silence, the kind so deep it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. And then, the whisper came again. Only this time, it was closer. I turned and walked away, faster than I intended, nearly breaking into a run by the time I reached the living room. The fireplace was still empty, the air inside the house stagnant and cold. I dropped my bag on the couch and sat down heavily, running a hand over my face. I was exhausted. That was all. The long drive, the stress of dealing with the inheritance, the weight of returning to this place, it was messing with my head. I needed to sleep. Everything would make sense in the morning. But as I sat there, trying to convince myself that nothing was wrong, I heard it again. The whisper. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was right behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to move, to bolt out the front door, to run into the night, to put as much distance between myself and this house as possible. But my body refused to obey. The whisper had been so close. Right behind me. And worse, it had been my name. A slow, creeping dread unfurled in my chest, tightening around my ribs like a vice. I could hear my pulse hammering in my ears, feel the cold sweat trickling down the back of my neck. Then, ever so softly, I heard it again. A breath, just inches from the back of my head. I shot to my feet, spinning around so fast that I nearly tripped over the coffee table. There was nothing there. Just the empty, dimly lit living room. The same dust-covered furniture. The same darkened fireplace. Nothing had changed, but I knew what I'd heard. I took a shaky step back, my breath coming fast and shallow. The air around me felt heavier now, charged with something unseen, something watching. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, like the house itself was waiting for me to react. I forced myself to move, to do something other than just stand there, paralyzed with fear. My hands shook as I fumbled in my bag, pulling out the flashlight I'd brought with me. The electricity in the house was unreliable at best, and I wasn't about to be caught in complete darkness if the lights decided to fail. I clicked it on. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the walls, the furniture, the floorboards. My eyes darted to the hallway, to the locked door at the end. The chains glinted in the dim light, motionless. But something was wrong. The dust on the floor, the thick layer that had settled over everything in the house from weeks of neglect, it had been disturbed. Footprints. Not mine. I felt my throat tighten. The prints led away from the locked door, trailing through the hall, past the living room, and ending directly behind where I had been sitting just moments ago. My stomach twisted into knots. I wasn't alone in the house. The realization sent a wave of nausea through me. Someone else was here. Someone had been standing right behind me, close enough to whisper my name. And yet, the house had been locked. The chains on the door hadn't moved. No windows were open. None of it made sense. I needed to get out. Now, I grabbed my car keys off the table, my hands still trembling as I turned toward the front door. But the moment I reached for the handle, a sound stopped me cold. A single, deliberate knock. Not at the door. Not at a window. From inside the house. It came from the locked room. A hollow, deliberate knock, 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 like knuckles rapping against wood. I took a step back, my mind racing. The footprints, the whispers, the knocking. This wasn't my exhaustion playing tricks on me. Something was in there, and it wanted me to know it. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to think. I had two choices. I could leave, get in my car, drive to the nearest motel, and pretend none of this was happening. Or I could open the door. The thought made my skin crawl. I didn't want to see what was behind it. I shouldn't see what was behind it. But if I left now, that door would still be locked when I came back. The thing inside would still be waiting. I had to end this. My feet felt like lead as I moved toward the hallway, my flashlight beam bouncing off the walls. The air grew colder with every step I took, until my breath came out in visible puffs. The closer I got, the more wrong the house felt, like I had crossed some invisible threshold into a place I wasn't meant to be. The knocking had stopped. The silence was worse. I reached the door, swallowing hard as I inspected the chains. The locks were old but sturdy. There was no way to open them without the keys, and I had no idea where Uncle Henry had kept them. And then I saw it. A note, wedged between the chains, barely visible in the dim light. The paper was yellowed, brittle with age. My fingers felt numb as I reached for it, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was shaky, frantic. Do not open it. Do not listen to it. If it calls your name, run. I stared at the words, my pulse thundering in my ears. Then, from deep within the locked room, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A laugh. Low, wheezing, barely human. And then, the chains rattled. Not a little. Not from the house shifting or the wind. They jerked violently, as if something on the other side had gripped them and pulled. The sound of metal groaning echoed through the hall, sending a fresh wave of terror through me. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my grip. Something was trying to get out. And for the first time since I'd arrived, I understood something terrible. The chains weren't meant to keep me out. They were meant to keep it in. The rattling stopped suddenly, and the house fell deathly silent once more. But I didn't wait around to see what would happen next. I turned and ran. My boots pounded against the wooden floors as I tore through the house, nearly tripping over the threshold in my desperation to reach the front door. My hands fumbled with the knob, slick with sweat, before yanking it open. The night air hit me like a slap, sharp and freezing, but I didn't care. I sprinted down the steps, across the driveway, toward my car. My breath came in ragged gasps, my lungs burning, my mind screaming at me to get the hell away. I reached for the door handle, yanking it open. But just as I slid into the driver's seat, I heard something that made my entire body go rigid. A voice. Not from inside the house. Not from behind the locked door. From the passenger seat. Leaving so soon? I whipped my head around it and screamed. Please like and subscribe. Every bit of support means the world.